I first heard about The Last Case of Benedict Fox shortly before it came out, and its graphic aesthetic immediately drew me in. Basically all I knew about it was that people were calling it a Lovecraftian Metroidvania, so now that I finished it, here are my thoughts. I'll start with my favorite thing about it. I'm sure a big draw for other people is going to be its stunning art design, just as it was for me. With a wide variety of environments rendered in saturated colors, the spaces you move through often reach all the way up to the foreground, sometimes limiting your visibility for the sake of immersion. It's not the first time I've seen that in a platformer, but I thought it was well done here, even though there were some annoying moments when I couldn't see enemies. The rooms also extend to the background with vestiges of the real world distorted and scattered into what is in the game's narrative, a hellish reflection of reality. There was so much variety in areas, textures, and color schemes that it never felt like areas were repeating themselves. I never noticed recycled assets. Rather, there was always something new to look at, from a blurred out spider moving from its web in the foreground, to an occult laboratory bathed in orange light, to a somber statue standing over you in the background. And all of that doesn't even get into the degree of motion this world has, with rippling pools of ink, swaying tentacles, and storms of electricity keeping the environments feeling lively. The character animations are fluid and impactful, particularly in combat when you use your companion's various abilities. You can grab enemies and hurl them across the arena, tear their shield away from them, and use the companion to help you make jumps, its tentacles always responsive to your specific position and momentum. Bringing up your barrier at just the right moment slows down time and sends projectiles flying back at enemies. I take issue with the degree to which some of your abilities minimize the challenge of combat, and I'll get into that more later, but for now, I think everything is animated really well. Exploration and puzzle solving go hand in hand here, since backtracking and opening up new areas isn't just dependent on gaining new abilities, but rather on solving the various puzzles the game throws at you. There's a decent variety here, some that require you to carefully think through their logic, and some time-based puzzles that need quick reaction times. Despite the number of different puzzle types, the game has an issue with bottlenecking solutions, by which I mean that in the case of some types, once you've figured out one, you've basically figured them all out, since the same logic can be applied to solve subsequent puzzles. This means some types will feel redundant after the third or fourth time you solve them. On the other hand, some puzzles don't have a one-size-fits-all solution, despite sharing the same premise. The disparity in puzzle complexity means that some puzzle types are consistently engaging, while others are little more than locks that require the same key, one after the other. You're rewarded for exploration with collectible items, some of which have a function and some of which are purely for world building. The former might be used to upgrade your weapons or aid you as you set about solving puzzles. The latter category makes up the majority of the things you'll find. These are items that gradually feed you bits of information regarding the protagonist's father and his father's wife, as well as the history of the First Circle and other occult societies. Unfortunately, I think this method of storytelling is at odds with the kind of story the game is trying to tell. The heart of the narrative here is personal and small in scope, despite existing in a much bigger world. The characters are supposed to be emotional anchors, serving to keep the plot grounded in the actions of a few people rather than the faceless secret societies that constantly lurk in the background. While the drip-feed style of storytelling is well suited for the game's broader exposition, it keeps the player several arms lengths away from the characters, softening the impact of every development and plot twist, since I wasn't invested in these characters to begin with. Functional is how I would describe the story and characters. The Last Case of Benedict Fox opens with a simple premise. The titular protagonist is cursed to share his body with a creature called the Companion, and he means to go against the authority of an occult secret society called Ordo Urudae in order to remove it. It's functional. Benedict Fox has a reason to traverse the First Circle of Hell, here called Limbo, and put himself in harm's way. Unfortunately, I found the character motivations and development to be surface level at best. I can't get too specific without spoiling it, but suffice to say that there are multiple character moments that I felt were completely unearned. It's functional, but it doesn't stand on its own as a compelling narrative. The lore that you find in bits and pieces throughout the game never goes very deep, with the basic histories of various secret societies, as well as the residents of the manor, being established early on, with substantive additions being few and far between. Still, it's enough world building to establish a sense of setting for the game to take place in. The other characters are also there to serve functions that are varying degrees of shallow. You have characters like Harry, the tattooist, and the weaponsmith, whose main roles are to offer upgrades and purchases. Sometimes you have reason to engage in conversation with them, and at these points, their archetypal personalities become most apparent, with Harry being a sympathetic father figure, the weaponsmith being a blunt man of few words,
Here's what we're gonna do.
and the tattooist being mysterious and seductive.
Don't keep me waiting.
Everything they say adheres strictly to those descriptions, and they don't contribute to the plot in any meaningful way. The father is an obsessive occultist, his wife is a naive optimist turned disillusioned realist, and the bad guy believes that the ends justify the means. Those basic descriptions inform everything they do, with little in the way of surprise or character development. Possibly the worst offense is just how boring the protagonist is. He's a detective with a demon trapped in his mind, and yet everything he says could not be more bland and lacking in personality.
Glad you came back, my beautiful canvas.
Ma'am?
The absence of memorable characters is detrimental to a story that's trying for the most part to be small in scale and focused on characters. I never felt emotionally invested in any of them. I never learned what life was like for Benedict and his demon companion before they crossed paths, never mind the impact it had to be unable to separate. I didn't know what the stakes were for them specifically. As for the father and his wife, the tragedy that befell them doesn't mean anything to me because I was never able to get close to them. Their stories are told after the fact and from a distance, through collectibles and notes. While this can be an effective method of storytelling, it didn't work here for me because I never got a sense of much depth from these characters, and I never felt that these were humans with complex wants and passions. I won't spoil how the ending plays out, but there's a line of dialogue from the antagonist where, as I implied earlier, he almost explicitly says that the ends justify the means. It gives me a bad guy to fight, but nothing for me to think about, and nothing to challenge me. Again, in a word, functional. Early into the game, combat is very deliberate, which I enjoyed quite a bit. Attacking multiple enemies at the wrong moment using your bayonet opens you up to damage. You can create a momentary barrier using your companion, but you don't always have time for that. And since you can only take 4 damage before dying, you as the player are encouraged to be careful, slow, and deliberate, which I appreciate as a design philosophy. I liken the way the combat is designed and balanced in the early game to a Souls-like. I didn't have much to get me out of a jam if I made just a few mistakes in succession. On more than a few occasions, my character and the enemies on screen would stand still, waiting for the other to attack first to avoid becoming vulnerable at the wrong moment. The similarity to Souls-likes extends to the way dying works mechanically too. When you die, you go back to a checkpoint, and for the most part, the enemies respawn. You keep your progress, but you drop whatever ink you didn't secure and have to pick it up before your next death, or else it goes back to the enemies you got it from, like the Souls in Dark Souls. There are some differences that lessen the penalty for dying, like the fact that you can secure your currency so that there's no longer a risk of losing it permanently, but I think that these fundamental traits are clearly borrowed from the Souls-like genre, and the way these mechanics came together in the early game worked really well for me. The enemy types are unfortunately pretty limited, with 3 archetypes of which there are a few variations. You have your humanoid enemy, who will engage you in melee combat when you're close, and shoot at you when you move away. You have these creatures closer to the ground that'll jump at you, and you have your flying enemies, some of which will shoot at you, but most of which will come down and try to hit you. While these 3 categories force you to engage with each enemy type differently, the variation within each category doesn't amount to much more than bigger equals stronger. There are also human occultist enemies, and while they were generally more reactive to my movement, they didn't force me to engage with them much differently than I would the humanoid demons. Despite the limited enemy types, I think this is a solid foundation for combat. I was excited to see how the challenge would scale as I progressed. So, I was disappointed to discover that whereas the challenge in the early game is tough but engaging, the game very quickly becomes surprisingly easy. As you gain additional abilities and upgrade those abilities, the enemies can't keep up, even in the later areas of the map that have more powerful enemy types. Early on, you'd have to slowly charge your flare gun by hitting enemies with your bayonet, earning every shot. Once you upgrade your weapons though, flare gun ammo becomes much more common, and seeing as how most enemies die with one shot, this takes away from the challenge of combat drastically. Early on, I was discouraged to heal during combat, since healing more than a single health point required me to hold down the corresponding button for a few seconds, which was usually more time away from the enemy than I had. This forced me to be careful and deliberate. After upgrading my healing ability though, I didn't have to think about it at all, since I could regain every health point with one quick click. It completely changed the cadence of gameplay. It's as if the core of the combat was designed with one philosophy in mind, and the upgrade tree takes out every nuance that made it so engaging to begin with. I played on the default difficulty, so it's likely that bumping it up would have been better for me, but this still points to balancing issues. Where the game has a big blind spot is in boss encounters. I had maybe 2 proper boss fights that required me to fully engage with the combat mechanics. Though I won't get into the second one to avoid spoilers, the first one happens early on. It's a fairly straightforward affair where you dodge the giant tentacles before attacking them. Despite its simplicity, I found it to be one of the best combat moments in the game, as it forced me to use my limited abilities thoughtfully and deliberately, which, as I detailed earlier, is a trait that the game loses later on. After beating this boss, I thought that surely there would be more like it. Perhaps each new area would have a new boss encounter, each of which would similarly engage the combat mechanics to their full potential, and maybe even add more elements of platforming. That was not the case. This game has a problem combining combat and platforming in any meaningful way. Combat arenas are usually completely flat, almost making me wonder why this game is an action platformer in the first place. The very rare exceptions to this, i.e. the occasions when you have to climb and fight simultaneously, showcase how restrictive the movement in this game is, since you usually can't do much more than reach a platform, defeat the enemy on it, reach a platform, defeat the enemy, etc, etc. You aren't jumping from point to point in the middle of a fight because the combat and platforming mechanics aren't designed to enable that. All of that to say that in lieu of this more traditional type of boss fight, we get poorly implemented running and stealth sections that don't have the mechanical infrastructure to make them interesting. Sure, you need momentum to make jumps sometimes, but the platforming doesn't have much more nuance to it than that. So when you're running from a giant monster, and the only challenge is to jump at the right moment and block some approaching debris, the faults in this game's platforming design become even more apparent. The game's inability to meaningfully combine combat and platforming reaches its peak when it momentarily abandons both altogether in favor of a short stealth section, where all you do is move from cover to cover, some of which the boss can literally see through, which I don't think was intentional. Again, I wonder why this section is here at all when it's neither mechanically nor technically sound, and that's about the extent of the boss fights in this game. Now on to performance. I played this game on a laptop running an AMD 6800M graphics card, and no matter the graphics settings I chose, the game could not hit a consistent 60 frames per second. I experienced constant micro-stuttering that made an otherwise beautiful game look slightly choppy. It was also obvious when sections of the level would load in, since Benedict would freeze mid-jump for a split second before completing his animation. I experienced a few minor bugs, though fortunately nothing game-breaking. For example, I would sometimes get stuck on ledges mid-jump and wouldn't be able to get unstuck, my only options being to fast travel to a checkpoint or if there was an enemy nearby, to take damage. Flying enemies would continue to move around while the game is paused, though I don't think they could deal damage. And while in the dark tunnel sections, there were a couple of times that my flashlight got stuck pointing at the ground, and to fix that, I had to restart the game. These were minor annoyances for the most part, though I'd still hoped to see better optimization on PC. I came away from the last case of Benedict Fox with the impression that while it's obviously a visually impressive game, the mechanics get in the way of it reaching its own potential. The upgrade path removes the nuances of combat. The exploration, while fairly engaging, depends too much on the spectacle of its art design and varies in the quality of the puzzles it presents. And even though the premise is interesting, the plot is limited by archetypal characters that rarely surprise. There are certainly people who will enjoy this. I myself enjoyed it for its art direction, Lovecraftian aesthetic, early deliberate combat, and some of the more challenging puzzle types. But for others, the inconsistency in quality will keep this game from being more than a poorly executed melting pot of game design tropes. So, if you've played it, what camp do you fall into? And if you haven't, are the positives enough to make you want to? Let me know in the comments below. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching my very first YouTube video ever. I'm very excited to keep making game reviews, so if you liked this one, consider leaving a like and subscribing to stay updated. Thanks for watching.